In the words of Chris Corbett, this case is all about cell phone communications. So today, in the third version of Trial Countdown Charlie Adelson, we're going to revisit Sergeant Chris Corbett. You'll recall he was the communications expert in both the 19 and 22 trials, and indeed he has been identified as the communications expert analysis for Charlie's upcoming trial. So today let's explore Chris Corbett and what we've heard from him before in the first two trials, but again from the perspective of this trial, Charlie Adelson, the first of an Adelson to be put at court. All right, let's get to it. Now, Sergeant Chris Corbett is the head of the Technical Operations Unit for the Tallahassee Police Department, which really focuses on computers, mobile devices, tablets, and cell phone devices for forensic analysis. Now, he was one and will be one of the key witnesses for establishing these patterns of communication that linked the parties together, the suspects and the actors, and including Charlie Adelson, the alleged maestro of the entire murder-for-hire plot. Now, I've gone through Sergeant Corbett's testimony from the 19 and 22 trials, and again, focused on what we could learn and see for this defendant, Charlie Adelson. Now, in this video, that's what we're going to be limited to. Sergeant Corbett is going to be an important witness for other areas that are beyond the scope of this particular interview. For example, we will see him again testifying to Wendy's whereabouts. Remember, he plotted her whereabouts with the cell phone, the call detail records, the CDRs, and her travels when she left her home and ultimately met her friends for lunch. Remember, he had a lot of testimony on the actions of Garcia and Rivera when they were in Tallahassee for both of the trips. Also, Corbett testified a lot to what are the aspects of cell phone forensics. What is a cell site? What is a tower dump? What is a frequency report, etc. I'm not going to focus on those aspects of his testimony in this video, but we will see them again in Charlie's trial. Now, before I go into the takeaways from Sergeant Corbett's testimony, I thought it would be helpful to revisit the types of evidence that he and his team have already broadly analyzed in the prior trials. So the first main type of evidence that he and his team analyzed are CDRs, or call detail records. And these are basically the business records that the police get directly from the provider. So for example, the records from AT&T. And what they provide is subscriber information such as the count holder, and they also provide the specific records of the calls and texts that are made from that device. And so it'll tell who it was receiving the call and who was sending the call. It will tell the time of the call, the duration of the call, and in most of the providers, they'll also provide the cell site that actually was connecting with the device for that particular call. Now, unfortunately, what you will not see in CDRs are things that are Wi-Fi based. So you won't see a messaging and apps. So you won't see, for example, FaceTime calls. You won't see iMessages. You won't see WhatsApp, that type of thing. So it's only going to really be telephone calls and texts from those providers. And those are the records that they get from the providers themselves, CDRs. Now, with respect to the CDRs, the ones we know that they have are all of the Adelsons. So that means Donna, Harvey, Charlie, Wendy. We have from Luis Rivera. We have it from Sigfredo Garcia for both phones, his regular phone and his burner phone that he had on him when he was arrested. We also have CDRs for Katie, both her phone and her burner phone. And we also have CDRs for Dan Markel. But again, they're not going to contain those app or Wi-Fi based information. Now, the second type of information that Chris Corbett and his team had access to in this case was tower dump information. And basically what that is, that's also, again, information that the police receive from the providers themselves. So in this case, there was four. There was AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, and Sprint. And it's basically site-specific information based on a location and time. And they basically, it's a dump. It is what it is. It's just a dump of cell phones that were pinging off a particular cell site at a particular time. Now, the third types of information that Chris Corbett and his team used was called frequency reports. And what those were is once they have the raw data, they're able to use software to figure out for a specific phone number, who are their top callers, who are the top numbers that are interacting with that particular number. The fourth type of information that Sergeant Corbett and his team had access to were iCloud records. Now, iCloud records are from Apple, and they're basically broader than what you would get from the CDRs because it can have any type of information that's in the cloud that the person themselves chose to back up. Now, it's limited in the sense that if the person's not good with backing up or has deleted things, then you may not be able to see it. But if they've been backing up fairly regularly, it's going to contain things such as the phone calls, of course, but then it's going to have things such as iMessages, FaceTimes, DMs, location information, call logs, calendar entries, pictures. I mean, we understand from Charlie Adelson's iCloud alone, there's over 300,000 iMessages. So we have iCloud information. And we know that they have iCloud information for Charlie Adelson, Katie Magbanowa, and Dan Markel. Now, they could have more. That's just what we know from the prior trials. The fourth information that Sergeant Corbett and his team had at their disposal in this particular case was wiretaps. So those, if you recall, took place from early April to June, and it was the TPD that actually was responsible for monitoring those wiretap calls. There were 3 numbers that were tapped for that time period of April to June. It was Charlie Adelson's phone and Katie's main phone, and the burner phone that she received allegedly, her and Sigfredo allegedly went out and bought from a Walmart the day before he was arrested. Later that evening, after, remember, the FBI went and spoke to him at his work. So those are the types of information that he and his team had access to. Just, I think it's helpful to kind of remember, like, what are they looking at? So these are the types of things that they're looking at. Okay, now let's go ahead and get into my takeaways for Chris Corbett and what he might be able to tell us with respect to Charlie Adelson's trial. Okay, so before we get into my takeaways, as you remember, Charlie Adelson and every defendant is always presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Okay, so let's get on to the takeaways. Okay, so my first takeaway, I'm going to start calling them connections, right? They're really connections. So my first connection with respect to Sergeant Corbett's testimony and the Adelsons really is the first one that started it all. And that was that information that he and his team did early on in the investigation, where they took the phone numbers for the subjects involved, and those included the Adelson family, probably included other people, but it definitely included the Adelsons, and they ran that through the tower dump information that they got from those 4 companies, the AT&T, Verizon, Sprint, T-Mobile. And so they put into the system those phone numbers of persons of interest, compared it with a tower dump, and voila, they got a number.
What we got back was, again, a list of all the phone numbers that had events or were present in those cell sites during those times. So in essence, that's just a list of unique phone numbers. In addition, we had a significant number of call detail records from all the subjects involved in the investigation. It could be the Adelsons, the victim, a number of people that we already had records for. So again, those are also a list of phone numbers calling one another. So we were actually compared all the numbers that were here in Tallahassee, that were near those towers around those times, to see if they had any connection to any of the other persons that we already had records for. Did anyone's phone number that was here have communication with someone that was involved in our investigation?
So did anybody in Dan Markel's life have contact with any of the phone numbers from that tower dump?
We did find this 786 number that was present in the tower dump, was also present in Harvey Adelson's call detail records.
Okay.
So when they did this, they got a hit for a 786 number. And that's when they determined that belonged to Sigfredo Garcia.
And were you able to identify who that 786 number that left a voicemail to Harvey Adelson on July 1st, who that number belonged to?
Yes, that number was associated with Mr. Garcia.
Now, this then allowed them to do a frequency report on Sigfredo's phone, and again, to see what that number is, what are the top contacts, what are the most frequent contacts that person's talking with. And who did we get? Katie. Katie was his number one. And so with Katie's number, they can do another frequency report on Katie. And what do they find? Well, they find out that one of Katie's top frequent contacts is Sigfredo. So that's good. Double checking our work.
Was Catherine Magvanoa's phone number found in any other records that you had as part of this case?
Again, as I mentioned, a frequency report is a common thing for us to do with all records. We did have a frequency report for Mr. Adelson, Mr. Charlie Adelson's records, and what we saw was that her number appeared in his records as well, and for the period of these particular records, it was the second most frequently contacted number.
So you find Garcia's records in this tower dump communicating near Premier Gym. You compare his number against all the Adelsons and find only one contact ever from him to Harvey Adelson, and it was just a voicemail. So then you look at Garcia's frequency report to see if any of his top contacts have any contact with any Adelson, if there's any link to him and the Adelsons. And this is what you found?
That's correct.
So the other thing that they also got out of Sigfredo's number, and remember again, Sigfredo's number came from Harvey's number, but they also find Luis Rivera is one of Sigfredo Garcia's frequent contacts. So then they have this phone number. They do that as a comparison to the tower dump, and boom.
Knowing that we had two persons who had came to Tallahassee, we did actually compare the numbers in his frequency report back to that tower dump data that we got. And what we found is that there was an AT&T phone number that was in a cell site here in Tallahassee that was also in his frequency report.
And who did that number belong to?
That number belonged to Luis Rivera.
So again, guys, just taking a step back, if we hadn't had that phone call from Sigfredo Garcia on July 1, which we're about to get to, we wouldn't have had potentially, I mean, that's really what broke open this case very early on. And you can see how the investigators were able to build upon that with using this, with these tools that are at Sergeant Corbett and his team's disposal. So pretty cool. I just thought I would start with that because it really all started with Harvey. Okay, connection 2, the July 1 incident and those calls to Harvey Adelson. Now, if you recall, we have this story from Katie that the reason that Sigfredo even called Harvey to begin with was a total mistake. She was embarrassed about it. She said he was really trying to call Charlie, not Harvey. And it was after this confrontation that they had at her apartment that day, on July 1st, early that day, when she said she and Charlie were together in the Lexus before Charlie had given or sold it to Katie. And he was towing the jet ski behind him. And remember, they were going to go jet skiing. And Sigfredo shows up and he causes this big scene and he gets out of his car. And remember, Katie said, Charlie was freaking out and she was freaking out and they had this whole scene and then they drove away. So that was what supposedly was the story behind this whole, why in the heck is Sigfredo calling Harvey Adelson, right? So now Chris Corbett, if you recall, tried to suggest that there was some subsequent iMessages from Charlie's iCloud that supported their theory. However, Sergeant Corbett testified otherwise.
Is it your understanding of that day, and again, we're trying to get to the truth, not just come back and say that there was a direct communication by Sigfredo Garcia, that Miss Magbanua was very upset at what Sigfredo Garcia had done?
Yes.
That Sigfredo Garcia, again, had run up on them in traffic and started banging on the window?
Again, I have heard something about that incident. There's nothing in the messages that reference that incident.
Now, there is reference, however, that Miss Magbanua did not like the fact that someone, Sigfredo Garcia, thinks that they can make the decisions in her life.
Correct.
So our understanding of all of these communications, Sigfredo Garcia confronts Charles Adelson when Catherine's with him. Catherine is then communicating with Sigfredo Garcia, presumably upset about the fact of what he had just done, correct?
Again, I have no personal knowledge of the interaction between Mr. Adelson, Ms. Magbanua, and Mr. Garcia, the physical interaction that day. So I cannot speak to that. There are a number of calls from Ms. Magbanua to Mr. Garcia, attempted calls or text. The text messages, the review of the iCloud, do reference Mr. Garcia leaving a message. She was presumably with Mr. Harvey Adelson. She's certainly upset with him. There's communication about that, but nothing that references a physical confrontation.
So what more could we see now that we have Charlie Adelson himself on trial when they've got Charlie's iCloud? So hopefully he was really good at backing things up, right? Remember, before, we saw actually Katie's defense bringing in some of these iMessages. This wasn't the prosecution bringing in some of these iMessages. This was the defense. So again, the prosecution's going to bring forward what's most helpful for them based on the specific defendant, right? Situation. So I'm crossing my fingers that in those 300,000 messages, there's some good stuff there, right? I mean, who knows? Maybe we have some WhatsApp information. I mean, probably not, but maybe. But there's lots of stuff in an iCloud, right? And so, again, because we have an Adelson on trial, I expect that we're going to get a lot more information from Charlie's iCloud and any other iClouds they might have in this trial. So my next connection that Chris Corbett and his team uncovered was connections that Charlie had leading up to the day of the murder. So on the evening of July 14th, Katie and Charlie had been messaging, and they would end up meeting later that evening. And what is important is that the call records show that after Charlie left late that night, early morning, Katie then had a flurry of communications with Sigfredo. Then, bright and early at 9 a.m. for Sigfredo, he gets up, and what does he first do? He starts calling Comfort Rent-A-Car, which you recall was the rental company that he had used previously on that June trip, allegedly. So, bright eye and bushy tail on Tuesday, July 15th, around 9 a.m., he starts calling Comfort Rental Car. Now, later that afternoon, he has correspondence with Luis Rivera, and he winds up calling Hybrid Save Gas, which is the same company, later that afternoon. Now, if you remember, again, Hybrid Save Gas is the company that Luis actually wound up renting the Toyota Prius from, presumably with Sigfredo, his brother, with him by his side on July 15th. So go ahead and insert some testimony now.
The night on July 14th of 2014, the night before the car was rented, did you look at the cell phone records to see what communications led up to the car rental?
It did, yes.
And what communications were there between the defendant and Sigfredo Garcia that night? And also between the defendant and Charlie Adelson.
Well, again, we see the evening of the 14th into the early morning hours of the 15th. We see that there are communications both with Mr. Garcia and Mr. Adelson, Charlie Adelson.
Do we have any information about Charlie Adelson's plans or locations that evening?
I believe we do, yes.
Okay. Can you show that to us?
So we see that there is an incoming voice call from Mr. Adelson at 8:52. Again, one of the other resources we have is the iCloud account for Mr. Adelson, which does contain some messaging. So looking around the time of this, we see that there is a message that indicates I just tried calling you. So this would be from Mr. Adelson to Ms. Bagbanova.
Okay, and what do you see after that?
Then we see a response, hey, no, I'm hungry, but you can come down here. We can eat in Midtown.
Okay, and are you able to see what his locations were during those times or that evening?
I am. As we continue through the messages, we see that he says 5 minutes on 79 and okay. So looking at his locations, we see that those first events at 9 p.m. would be consistent with the area of his residence. And then the next event that we have with location is 27 minutes later, which would again be consistent with the area of Ms. Bagbanova's residence.
And does he stay the night there or does he go home after that?
I believe he goes home after that.
Now, after Charlie Adelson leaves her home that night, does her handset communicate with Sigfredo Garcia?
It does, yes.
And where is Catherine Magbanwa during her communication with Sigfredo Garcia that night?
She would be consistent with the area of her residence.
That communication with Garcia would have been between 12:48 a.m. and 1:56 a.m.?
Yes, if you're referring to these communications here,
Okay.
which begin, as you said, 12:48, and they run through 1:56 a.m.
All right, so moving on to the next day, July 15th of 2014, the day that the Prius was rented. What company does Sigfredo Garcia call the morning of July 15th?
What we see is after those events that we just talked about in the early morning hours with Ms. Magbanova, there are a number of events, calls, or text, and the first rental car that we see is the Comfort Rent-A-Car, which is an outgoing call at 9:09 a.m.
So he calls Comfort Rental at 9:09 a.m.?
That's correct.
And that's the same company that he used for the June rental car?
That's correct.
Are there any calls between Garcia and Rivera that morning before he calls Comfort Rental Car at 9 a.m. or 9:09 a.m.?
There are not.
As the day goes on, after Sigfredo Garcia calls Comfort Rental, are there a number of other communications between Rivera and Garcia and the defendant throughout the day?
There are, yes.
Which rental company does Sigfredo Garcia call at 4:28 p.m.?
He calls Hybrid Rental, also known as Save Gas.
Okay. And after that call, is there more communication between Garcia and Rivera?
There is, yes.
You analyze Luis Rivera and Garcia's phone records in relation to the rental car company.
Yes, again, looking at their events around the time of the rental contract, we see that both of their handsets are communicating with cell sites consistent with that general area.
And that's at the time that the car was rented or around that time?
That's correct.
Okay, this is where it gets a little interesting. And I almost want like a big whiteboard to put down like who's doing what in where, right? Like what's going on this day in Miami? What's going on this day in Tallahassee? Okay, so we just went over Monday, July 14th. That was when Katie met up with Charlie. Then Charlie leaves. She starts texting Sigfredo. And then Tuesday, the next morning, July 15th, Sigfredo calls. And there's all this communication and ultimately the renting of the Prius. What's going on in Tallahassee those same days? Well, on Monday, July 14th, this is the day that Jeff sees Wendy again after their 2-week break when she was in South Florida. They go to dinner and movie, and that's when he testified that when they got back to her house that evening, she confided in him, allegedly, that Charlie had looked into hiring a hitman the year before, and it was chilling to him. We talked about that in my last video. So then what goes on in Tuesday in Tallahassee? Well, in Tuesday in Tallahassee, this is where it gets a little interesting. So remember, this is the last day that Jeff actually sees Wendy. So in his July 23 police interview that I'm going to link below, I'm going to link Deep Dive True Crime or Mentor Lawyer. He's like the king of all these interviews. So I'm going to include it below so you can go watch it. I highly recommend it. It's really good. But anyway, so on July 23, Jeff has a police interview, and he says that something really changed on that Tuesday for him.
So I had it out with her in Gainesville, and then she went to South Florida for 14 days. The whole time she's down there, she's miserable and not that available. But we're talking about future-oriented stuff. We're talking about trying to get back together and desperate to see each other. It sucks that we're separated in this bad situation. I can show you the text, like, can't imagine my life without you. God, I fucking miss you. I mean, these are like exact quotes, you know. She gets back to town. We go on a date. And I said it was awkward, but we were holding each other. We're holding hands. There was a future orientation still. We're going to spend a lot of time together and work this out. That's what we had decided to do. And that was last Monday. It gets really strange from there, and it makes me suspicious. And maybe I'm just paranoid. But then on Tuesday, she called me at 2 or 3 in the afternoon. And she said, I walked out of my house. We were going to see each other that night. And I say, okay, I walked out of your house. What are you going to do? I tried to get a key, but I probably need a locksmith. I said, oh, well, I'll come out and we'll just hang out on your front porch and have our date there. And she's like super sweet and friendly, and it was like everything was okay, actually. She was like, I would love it if you would come keep me company, see you in a little bit, calling each other baby, this kind of stuff. When I showed up to yoga, and it ended up that she got into her house, we went to yoga together instead, and we just met there. When I showed up to yoga at 7, something was completely different. She was gone. I mean, and that might have been just her talking to her friend and says dump him, and she decides it, and that's it. It may have nothing to do with your case. But I would be really curious to know, if I was you, who she talked to between 3 and 7, because something happened where I seem to be irrelevant all of a sudden. And this is after 15, 16 days of her wanting us to, let's just work this out. It just turned in a second.
So what do you think? Well, what's interesting is if you go back to Sergeant Corbett's testimony, Sigfredo calls hybrid rental at 4:28. Okay, so after 3, before 7. And boom, Lewis and Sigfredo allegedly go and rent the hybrid, the Prius from Hybrid Car Rental at 6:15 p.m. Jeff just said it was weird. He's like, who talked to Wendy between 3 and 7? Because when last time I talked to her, she was lovey-dovey, and the next time I see her, she's cold. And then the Prius GPS also had the Prius at Katie's residence the Tuesday, the 15th. And just to recall, Sigfredo and Lewis do ultimately leave in that Prius to Tallahassee the early afternoon of Wednesday, the 16th. So again, and they reach Tallahassee at midnight, or like early on the 17th. So again, what do you guys think? I mean, Jeff Lacasse is such a good witness. Like, I do recommend you go watch Mentor Lawyer's video. He did a compilation, but like, he's just got this sixth sense, right? He's like saying 3 to 7, then I go back and I'm like, oh my gosh, that's like the time frame when they rented this car. Anyway, it's all alleged, who knows, but I don't know. What do you guys think? Okay, let's go on to the next connection. Okay, I'll call this the flurry of calls the morning of. So this chart I'm going to insert here just shows just all the communication that was going on in the early morning hours, starting right after midnight up until really his murder. So I'm going to insert that here. And and some testimony as well.
Looking at the 18th, can you kind of just walk us through what you see here on that day?
So this would include beginning prior to the actual homicide, 12:01 a.m. We see that Ms. Bagbanawa, there's an outgoing call to Mr. Garcia. There's Ms. Bagbanawa and Mr. Adelson, contact between their numbers in the 12:07, 12:34. Mr. Adelson again up and through 1:03. Then it picks up again 8:09 in the morning with Wendy and Donna Adelson talking. There's communication again between Charlie and Wendy and some of the other players, Ms. Bagbanawa, Mr. Adelson, throughout that 9 and 10 a.m. time frame.
Okay. What's the red line that we see there?
The red line would indicate the time in these records where Mr. Markel was killed.
Okay. In the last call we see there, we see that after the point that he is murdered, Charlie Adelson has some contact with Donna Adelson. Catherine Bagbanawa and Charlie Adelson have some contact. And then the 12:30 call that we see, have we seen that call previously?
Yes, that is the call that we have mentioned prior from Mr. Garcia to Ms. Bagbanawa after the homicide.
So again, I mean, we have the call data reports, the CDRs. Do we have anything from Charlie's iCloud that can give us any more details on this stuff? Again, I think it was enough well, it obviously was. Both Sigfredo and Katie were convicted, but now we have an Adelson. So I don't know that necessarily we'll see more calls. Maybe we'll see, though, maybe things off his iCloud. I don't know. What do you guys think? Okay, connection 4. Charlie's activities right after the murder, also known as the money drop. So we know that Katie talked to Charlie in the evening of July 18th. And we get some iMessages between the two. And I'm going to go ahead and insert some testimony here.
Find any messages from Charlie Adelson's iCloud that could give any insight into Bagbanawa's locations that night?
We did, yes.
Okay, and what's that?
So there were communications earlier in the afternoon of the 18th that we see an inquiry about work, Mr. Adelson's response, about to start a big case, response, this is at 8:21 p.m. asking if still at work. The response at 8:23, just finishing, I'm not really feeling good, maybe we can just hang at my house.
Do you have any more location information for Catherine Bagbanawa's phone after her calls with Charlie Adelson at 10:20 when she's consistent with Rivera's residence?
We do not have any more location information for her handset that night or into the next morning.
So her handset doesn't have contact with any of the parties again that night?
There's attempted contact, but none of them actually reached the handset.
Okay, and I'll ask you about that in a minute. But from what we have from her, she's contacting Garcia a lot. Then she's no more contact with him once she's consistent with Rivera's residence. While at Rivera's residence, she has contact with Charlie Adelson. Earlier in the night, he's invited her over to his house, but then her phone goes off or is powered down, and we don't have any location information for her the rest of the night.
That's correct.
Now, as you can see, Katie's calls end with Charlie around that 10 and 20-ish time, and her device doesn't have any other activity for the rest of the evening. And this includes some missed calls from Sigfredo around 3 a.m.-ish that go right to voicemail. So the next time that Katie's phone has any activity is a chart that I'll insert. It's 9:44 a.m., and this is when she's going in the southbound direction away from Charlie's house, away from the location of Charlie's house. We don't know if she stayed there. And she's going south, and she's constantly trying to get in touch with Sigfredo.
What do we have up at the top of the screen here? What's the yellow flag?
At the very top, that yellow flag is Mr. Adelson's residence. And
Okay.
then we also have Mr. Rivera's residence. We can see that Mr. Adelson's residence is significantly further north in Miami.
Okay, so the last contact that she had on her phone, communication, on her phone before the 944 was at 10:20 the night before with Charlie Adelson.
Yes,
And that was after he invited her to his residence.
correct.
Okay. So then her phone is off the network. It then comes back on, and at 9:44 she has her first contact and her first location that we can see, and she's there in between Charlie Adelson's residence and Rivera's residence.
That's correct.
Okay. And then is that all the dots that we see her communication on her way south?
That's correct.
Okay.
I'm looking forward to reports in this trial that are organized around Charlie's communications, because you know there was a lot of communication going on. But again, in the trials before, we were focused on Katie, we were focused on Sigfredo, and Charlie came in, of course, because he's part of the alleged whole scheme. But now with Charlie's trials, I think we're really going to focus on Charlie and what may be in that iCloud. I can't wait to see all these cool reports that Sergeant Corbett and his team can prepare. I just can't wait to see all that information. What about you? So there are a couple of juicy extras. I don't know if they call them connections, but there was just a couple of juicy extras that I noticed when I was going through Sergeant Corbett's testimony from 2019 and 2022, including reading the transcripts, because if you read the transcripts, you get to read all the sidebars, and there's tons of information in the sidebar information. So anyway, one of the little juicy extras that I found was about Yardbird. And remember, we all are wondering, was there a confrontation between Charlie and Sigfredo at the Yardbird when Jeff Lacasse and Wendy met Charlie and Katie for dinner in that March time frame, March 2014, when Jeff and Wendy were down in South Florida doing alternative spring break. I'm going to go ahead and insert some testimony now.
Say something at 12:10 p.m. on March 12th about dinner the night before.
She does.
What does she say?
The message is, I guess, I don't know, he called me and said, have a nice dinner, and to never call him again. I'm like, WTF, question mark.
And what does she say after that?
There's some other exchange, but
After.
He's acting like a child. I don't even call him unless it has to do with the kids.
Okay, and then she says, I love you.
Baby, I love you too. I can't stand not hugging you before we go to bed and not waking up with you.
Okay.
To you.
So guys, that communication's talking, it's a March 12th communication talking about something that happened on March 11th. In the 2019 trial, Jeffrey Lacasse said it was March 11th. Now, I went back to his 22 testimony and he didn't really give an exact date, but I think it has to be March 11th. Now, I confirmed that the Immokalee alternative spring break that Wendy and Jeff went to was March 7th through 11th, 2014. Now, I'm inserting some articles that I found about it, but just know March 7th is a Friday and March 11th is a Tuesday. And so here's an article from Florida State, and then there's an article from the Florida Bar, which is the state's bar publication. Pretty cool. And it's talking about one of the law students that was there. But then at the end, you see that, there were 16 law students, 7 medical students, 2 faculty members from the College of Medicine, 1 from the College of Social Work. Well, we know who that was. That was Jeff Lacasse. And Wendy Adelson, a clinical professor at the FSU Medical Legal Partnership at the Public Interest Law Center, who chose this unique way to spend their spring break from March 7th to 11th, the 7th alternative spring break, which I think is really cool, by the way. Here's some quotes from Wendy. My students had the chance to expand their notions of what it means to be a lawyer and to use the law as a tool for social justice. Adelson said, we returned to Tallahassee with a renewed sense of purpose and possibility and enthusiasm for the privilege of studying the law and representing those most in need. So it's quite possible that Wendy and Jeff went to South Beach when this alternatives break ended on Tuesday. It ended on Tuesday 11th. And I'm showing a map here of where Immokalee is from Yardbird. So I'm inserting that here. They could have easily met Charlie for dinner on March 11th, as Jeff testified to in 2019. It's less than a 2-hour drive. It's just shy of 2 hours. No issues. The second kind of juicy tidbit I took from reviewing Chris Corbett's testimony was the Key West trip with Charlie and Katie. So you may recall I mentioned the Key West trip in episode 1 of Charlie's trial countdown when I was going over the testimony of both Marsha Rodriguez and Mary Hall. So it looks like that trip might have happened. So I'm going to go ahead and insert some testimony here.
He showed you a message where his mother asked if he was eloping with Catherine McBanois in June of 2014, and he said, no, there's a goodbye tour, and we're going on a goodbye tour in Key West. Does it say goodbye to who in those messages?
It does not.
Could be goodbye to Catherine McBanois, or it could be goodbye to Daniel Markel. You don't know.
I don't.
Eloping, I don't think there was ever any chance that Katie and Charlie were going to elope in Key West. Goodbye tour, possibly. Goodbye to Katie. I mean, she did testify that they kind of stopped dating a few months later after Dan Markel's murder. So, could be a goodbye tour to somebody else. This was 2 weeks before the murder. Remember, the Key West trip was the end of June. Kind of like having a celebration dinner. So what are your thoughts? What are some of the things that you remember from Sergeant Corbett's testimony? He was a good part of both trials. It was a little more streamlined in trial 2, and it might have just been because there was only one defendant. On trial 1, he was called back a couple of times, so things seemed to go a little smoother in trial 2. I think also the prosecution seemed to be a little bit more streamlined in trial 2, which you would expect. They did it once, they were working out the kinks, do it twice. I expect actually, in addition to seeing more potential evidence that involves an Adelson, I also expect for them to continue to hone their craft and, be even more amazing this time around. But they need to be, because Charlie's got, a great defense team as well. So this is going to be a really well lawyered trial. And so as a lawyer, I love watching, good lawyers on both sides. I think thanks again so much for joining. If you would consider liking and subscribing, I'm really trying to grow the channel. And thank you for all my returning subscribers. You guys are the best. You're so awesome. And I love how engaging you are. And I also appreciate keeping, the comments tasteful and really classy. And you guys are the best. So thank you so much. And I hope to see you in my next one. Bye.